Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, spirits of all ages, welcome to the BlunderSpeaker Show. Well, welcome back to the show, everybody. Great to see you here. We are, of course, the BlunderSpeaker Show. We are a Spirit Island podcast, and this is the show where everything is done in one take, and I can't get my intro right, but we'll keep going with it anyway. My name is Tepidgoose. Today we are Thursday, 13th of February, 12 minutes past 4 in the afternoon. As I say, everything gets done in one take, except my intro, which I usually practice once or twice and then cut out at the start. So I got a bit fed up with that, and said I'd just run with it. So it's getting a little bit on in the day. My poor wife has the kids all day, and I was supposed to have started this before now, but I was messing around with settings. So I mentioned last time out that I had figured some settings out, and I thought I had gotten a pretty good job on the visuals, and turns out I hadn't at all. And those of you with the keen eye, or rather not even needing a keen eye, will probably have noticed a whole pile of hand movement visuals and lag and all these kind of visual artifacts and things like that. And it took me forever to figure it out. So I got a fancy camera and I did not set it up right, and it looked bad. So anyway, look, I figured some settings out, and I think I actually have a better setup this time. So hopefully what you're looking and seeing right now is better than before. But you know, alas, if you're watching on video, or whether you are checking in on the audio medium now by podcast, that's all set up. So welcome back to those of you who are familiar with the show, of course, and to those of you who aren't, welcome to the show. If it's your first time stumbling across the BlunderSpeaker Show, as I say, we're here, we're talking about Spirit Island. You're going to love it. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Of course, everybody else, hit your like button, and welcome on in, and we shall jump right in and talk about what we're going to talk about, which is indeed, of course, France. So this is our France episode. It is our second episode in the Adversary Series. We started out, of course, with Sweden last time out, but here we are this time, and we are jumping right in. We're going to have a look at the spirit panel first of all. So as I say, this is the Kingdom of France. So let's bring that up on screen, and let's take a look, of course, at the top left hand corner, where we come across our first adversary that has a loss condition. So we said last time out, of course, Sweden didn't have one, and here we are with France, who came in as part of Branching Claw, and they brought their own loss condition, of course, along with them. Sprawling Plantations is what it's called. So this is before setup. Return all but 7 towns per player to the box, and invaders win if you ever cannot place a town. Well, what does that mean? First of all, 7 per player, that actually technically works out at 7 per board rather than 7 per player. Before I even jump in on what the rule means, I just stumbled across something interesting the other day, where Eric Royce himself spoke about this on some Reddit thread quite a while back. He actually in the end said that, probably for balance reasons, if you add an extra board to the game, it probably falls at about 4 or 5 extra towns per island board. So that's a little bit neither here nor there. Not sure why I put it right up front as part of the discussion, but again, like I said before, you have to come to expect the odd blunder or a misstep, or indeed terrible timing with what I'm doing. But look, what's happening here is you've got a bunch of towns per player, or indeed per board, whichever way you decide to play it, and that looks like 7 towns each, and basically you can place all of the 7 towns, and if you ever have to place an additional one, you lose the game. So obviously, if you're true solo, if you're one board, one spirit, you get 7 towns, and then once the 7 are on the board, if you ever have to place another one, that's when you lose. Obviously, then if you go and scale that up and you start playing in multiplayer environments, it's 7 per player, but clearly that's spread out then across the whole island. So certain boards can go to hell, while some others are kept clean, and that can kind of balance itself out that way. Now, look, this is more or less, the bread and butter of France. If you're not too familiar with them, this is how you're going to lose the game. And for everyone else who's very familiar with them, this is how we all lose the game, essentially, because this is where their difficulty is packed in. And I mentioned last time out, I figured France are about a difficulty 9, more or less on par with Sweden. I think sort of, the ratings of the game have them at 8 and 10. Ultimately, I think they're probably about on par at level 9, somewhere in the middle. And really, for France, the difficulty it comes from this one, as I say. But we shall see why, because the rest of the card obviously plays into how that works. Moving across, then we see the escalation. As we said before, they all have one, all of the adversaries, and this is called Demand for New Cash Crops. Now, after exploring, on each board, when you hit the escalation symbol, of course, you pick a land of the shown terrain, which is whichever land just explored, and then if it has buildings, you add a blight, otherwise add a town. So sometimes, the nice thing about this is it's giving you an option here. Do one, otherwise do the other. And sometimes you'll have an option here. Other times you won't. So the way this basically works is, let's say I explore wetlands. I go ahead and I place my explorers onto the wetlands on each board tile, and then I look at my usually 2 wetlands, unless I'm playing on the flip side of the board, and I look at and I pick one of the 2, and I choose to do one of these 2 effects. So if I have a building in one land, then I would have to place a blight. Otherwise, if I don't have any buildings in there, I can add a town. Now, clearly here, this is adding more towns, right? This is an effect that's starting to impact on that loss condition. So you're starting to get a kind of a cross-pollination here in terms of difficulty. I did say sometimes this gives you a choice, which is great, and we'll see that in France quite a bit, that there's a lot of player agency involved in playing against this adversary, and one way to do that is to sort of try to enable your board in such a way that you give yourself the option when it comes to that escalation effect, that I basically have 2 lands on my board. One of them might have buildings in it, and the other one won't, and then I have a choice. At that point, then, if I go ahead and explore, I can pick either or, and I can look and say, am I running out of blight? Do I need to protect the blight? Yep, I'll add a town. Otherwise, am I running out of towns? Yeah, I'm in trouble. Yeah, just get a blight on there. Even if it's a blight cascade, it doesn't matter. I've got enough blight at the moment. So you want to try be setting yourself up in the game that as you're managing your board, you will have those sort of terrains in a varied state. But again, we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the episode. And just before we go down through the levels, just want to point out on the top corner as well here on the board is the base difficulty of 2. And France is the one, it's tied with Habsburg Livestock for the most difficult of all the adversaries at its base level. So that gives you a base difficulty 2, whereas all the others give a base difficulty of 1. So something interesting to point out here. So then, of course, we have our 6 levels. They all have 6 levels, as we said before. Fear cards here are going to range from your standard 3-3-3 all the way up to a 4-5-5. As it happens, that's actually joint second highest. So the highest, we'll talk about the winner for the highest when we get to them in our Adversary Series, but these are going to be joint second with 2 others, so there's 3 essentially tied for second place. So it's in the top half is kind of maybe a better way to look at it. So 4-5-5, reasonably difficult, let's say. Now, let's go ahead and start going through the levels here. So we've got level 1 is called Frontier Explorers. And this is except during setup, after invaders successfully explore into a land which had no buildings, add an explorer there. This is where we're starting to run into problems right away. We're starting to get a lot of explorers onto the board. So this in itself doesn't interact with the loss condition, but we'll see why this is going to be a problem later on. But essentially, this is going to start adding plastic to the board, and it's going to do it quick. So when you explore, except during the setup, so the setup doesn't count here, which is great. If this happened during the setup, this will be a much tougher adversary, that is for absolute sure. So after the invaders explore into a land, so every land that they explore into, if the land had a building, you're good to go. If it didn't have a building, you add another explorer. So okay, starting to sound a little bit tricky, but we should be okay here. They're explorers, they're not towns, right? That should be fine. Let's get to level 2. Level 2 is slave labor. During setup, put the Slave Rebellion event under the top 3 cards of the event deck. Sounds interesting. Wonder what that is. We'll find out later in the show what that is. That is going to be the custom event for France, and we'll dig into that quite a little bit later. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to put an event in the deck, which is interesting. And then the other thing we're going to do here is, after invaders build in a land with 2 or more explorers, replace all but 1 explorer there with an equal number of towns. And now I'm starting to sound familiar. Now we're starting to think about, what are those explorers that came in level 1? Well, here's where they start to hit you and they start to hurt you right away at the very next level. So what happens here, when I go ahead and I do your build, regular build, extra build, doesn't matter. If I build in a land against France, if the land had basically more than 1 explorer, 2, 3, 4, doesn't matter. As long as it's more than 1, when I finish building, I then replace all but 1 of the explorers there with towns. So let's say, for argument's sake, I'll just take an example on our level 1 there. Let's say we just explored into an empty land. We put 2 explorers. Now we go to the build. We go build a town as normal, but then because there's 2 explorers in there, I'm going to go ahead and convert one of them explorers also into a town. So essentially I've gone from 2 explorers to a single explorer and 2 towns. Pretty hard, pretty tough. That brings a lot of difficulty right off the bat. But if you think about how bad that can get, if you've grouped up some of your explorers, maybe the land has 3, 4 explorers in it, you're going to replace all of them except 1 with towns, and that gets really tough really quickly. Next level, level 3. Early plantations. During setup, on each board, add a town to the highest numbered land without towns, and add a town to land number 1. So here we're going to go ahead and we're going to add 2 towns onto the board. More towns, more problems. You're starting to see what this all looks like. And by the way, just in case you were wondering, those towns that we're placing onto the board right now as part of level 3, they come from your stash, your 7 towns at the start of the game. So right away, you're going to go ahead, when you're starting the game, you're going to make 7 towns there. You're going to go and you're going to place 1 into your printed town icon, which is usually somewhere on the inland, around about land 7 or 8. You're going to put 1 in there. And now you're going to go ahead and you're going to add 1 to the highest numbered land that isn't that land, so they don't get grouped, they get in separate lands, and you also add 1 to land number 1. So that's going to add 3 towns on the board out of your 7 are going to start on the board, and that is tough. And by the way, here we are at level 3, and this, it's worth pointing out, we said how the base difficulty matches Habsburg for the hardest at difficulty or at base difficulty. When you get to level 3, France are the hardest level 3 adversary in the whole game, which is worth taking a sip of water and letting sink in for just a second. France 3 is, by printed difficulty and by the creators of the game, harder than every other adversary at level 3. That's because most of their difficulty is absolutely rammed and packed into those first 3 levels. It's all interacting together, it's creating problems, it's putting loads of explorers, it's converting them to towns and all that kind of stuff. So it's really, really tough. I should have pointed out, by the way, when I mentioned Slave Rebellion, Rebellion is actually a positive effect for the player. So that's not additional difficulty. In fact, rather the opposite. So we're talking about a difficulty 7 here by the time we get to level 3. And that's with a bonus for the player. It's a difficulty 7. So yeah, you can see just how tough these levels are starting to look. We'll continue. Level 4 is called Triangle Trade. Triangle Trade says, whenever invaders build a coastal city, add a town to the adjacent land with the fewest towns. So another ability that's adding more towns onto the board. This one, again, like the others, it's tough. As we're going up on level 4, 5, 6 now, the difficulty clearly tapers off, and it's not quite as nearly as big spikes once we get past this point, but this one hurts. Triangle Trade hurts. Like, if you think about it, every game you're going to start the game based on the previous level before it with a town in your land 1. Every time you play against France, you're starting with a town in land 1. If you hit that town on your opening explore, there's a very strong chance that's about to build a city and that's about to triangle trade, which places another town. So you're now right off the bat, you're going building another land somewhere on the board, if you can't stop that, of course. And then now you're doing the build the city and add the extra town. So you're just adding so many buildings and so many towns right off the bat in that really early game against France. So they come out really fast for different reasons than Sweden, but they really do put a lot of pressure on early. Next, level 5, slow healing ecosystem. When you remove Blight from the board, put it here instead of onto the Blight card. So here meaning the the panel basically. As soon as you have 3 per player on here, move it all back to the Blight card. So this is a funky, strange kind of unique ability that France bring, which punish Blight removal. Basically, when you remove Blight from the board, under normal circumstances, of course, it goes right back on the Blight card, and it kind of helps keep the island from flipping, or helps keep the loss condition at bay, and so on. But now, when we remove Blight, instead of it going back on the card, it goes on the spirit panel or the adversary panel, and it sits there until I've accumulated enough, or we've accumulated enough. That's 3 per player. That's a lot. Like, if you think about a regular game of Spirit Island, like, how often do you remove 3 Blight as part of your Blight removal? Not that many, I would say, players or even spirits are really, I would say, that way inclined. I certainly don't play a very strong kind of Blight removal focus in most of my games. We played, of course, with Transforming Wildfire as part of the playthrough, which we'll get to later in the episode, and clearly, that's a spirit that very heavily leans into Blight removal, but very few do. Like a handful of other spirits, like Keeper or Earth, or a couple of others, will have Blight removal as maybe one of the unique powers. But how often are they playing that card? They now have to do that 3 times in a game, or you have to draft a card and then do that 3 times just to get it back on the card. So this is most players would say this isn't difficult, because and when I said about that kind of tapering off in difficulty, it's not difficult in the sense that it doesn't do anything in a lot of games. It kind of just sits there, and it doesn't affect the board, and it doesn't, impact your game in terms of it's not extra invaders, it's not dealing extra ravages, it's not, even from a Blight perspective, it's not like it's creating extra cascades or anything like that. You can still remove Blight, you can still take it off the island board and kind of clean your island, but other than that, it sort of does quote unquote nothing. So I can see in that sense how this isn't difficult at all, but also it just punishes and shuts off almost an entire strategy. So whether you call that difficult or not, it's probably a little bit sort of maybe personal in terms of how you prefer to play the game. For me, I just more or less ignore this rule and act like it doesn't exist, and act like Blight removal doesn't exist, and it's kind of shut off. I can consider this almost no difficulty at all. But at the same time, there are certain scenarios and certain circumstances and certain spirits that it can shut off, which is maybe a little bit awkward more than difficult, I would say. Anyway, finishing out here, we've got level 6, and that is Persistent Explorers. So after the normal Explorer, on each board, add 1 Explorer to a land without any. Okay, so that's part of this ability, and then we've got a second part. Fear card effects never remove Explorers, and if one would, you may instead push the Explorer. So we've got 2 effects happening here as part of Persistent Explorers. So first thing is, after the normal Explorer, so this doesn't count extra Explorers. If an event or something would cause an extra Explorer, it won't count. So just the normal Explorer, but this does count on the first turn. So you've got a bit of a situation here where your level 6 will trigger on your opening Explorer, but your level 1 won't, and I really don't like that. I think I mentioned it in my playthrough. I think that's super clunky. I think for balance reasons, it's probably fine. And as I said, if level 1 triggered on the opening Explorer, I think it would be way harder. This adversary would be way harder. But for balancing reasons, it's fine. But mechanically, I just do not like that when you're doing that on the first turn, you've got this kind of sort of jarring effect almost, where you do one and not the other, and you have to remember that it's one and not the other, or you have to go and check the card and remind yourself. So anyway, all that aside, basically after the normal Explorer, on each board you add a single Explorer to add land without any, and that could be any land. Doesn't of course have to be the one that just explored. It probably won't be because there'll be explorers in those lands, but yeah, you just basically pick a land on the board, and you put one in there, and that can have a whole sort of range of impact on your game, ranging from almost nothing to that's super difficult. If I'm not under control of what's happening on my board, and I just keep adding those explorers in there, and I'm not getting rid of them, this can hurt, and it can add up in the game. So it's going to totally depend on the nature and sort of the progression of your game and how your board management is working out. But there's a couple of tricks you can do with this. So there's things like, and if you watch my playthrough, you'll have seen I do this quite a few times, where you've just cleared out a land that, for example, didn't build. So I don't know, you do some sort of tempo play where you stop a build in a land, and that land is now empty except for a Dahan or two, for example. Now I'm going to go ahead after I explore, and I can throw a single explorer into that land, and then that land will ravage on the next turn with just one explorer and a Dahan, and then you get a free kill on the explorer. So that's a very sort of, regular play pattern to keep an eye on when you're playing against France. So you definitely should be looking out for that one. And then that's where I said it has very little impact on the game. If you can keep doing those kind of plays and sort of throw the explorer out and have it die in some way or another, you can keep on top of your explorers that way. Some other ways, for example, that you can sort of get a not a benefit, but you can maybe manage this a bit, would be throw it into your beast land, and of course you get your kind of beast damage effects on your events that can matter. Throw them into lands with disease, and then whenever the next build comes up in that land, you at least stop the build and you don't do that conversion. It's worth pointing out as well, I didn't mention it, but the level 2 where it says after invaders build in a land with 2 or more, replace blah blah blah, that has to actually successfully build. So if you stop the build with a disease or something else, it won't trigger the ability. Similar with the obviously the level 1, they have to obviously actually explore into the land in order to put the extra explorers. So that's more or less everything there. It's worth pointing out, in case any of you are so inclined or that way inclined, if you combine France with other adversaries and do the kind of adversary combinations, France 2+, so from level 2 onwards, if you combine France 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 with another adversary, you will add towns to the pool. So this problem of running out of towns, it basically gets increased. So the way it works is you do +1 town per player per level of the other adversary. So let's just take a 6-6 as an argument, for argument's sake. If I do France, Scotland, 6-6, probably the easiest 6-6 in all of the options available. You would basically take your 7 towns per player, and then you would take, because I'm playing Scotland 6, I would take 6 extra towns per player into the pool. So essentially, instead of having 7 towns as your regular France condition, you would have 13 towns as part of your pool. So that makes that quite a bit easier. But it is worth noting, and it's quite funny that it only counts for France 2+. If you play France 1 with another adversary, you don't get that. So for argument's sake, take the same combination, France and Scotland. If I do France 1, Scotland 6, I basically I'm essentially just adding on France's loss condition, their escalation, and the extra explorers onto Scotland 6. And in many ways, people will say, and I actually haven't tested this myself, but people actually say that France 1 is harder to combine with other adversaries than France 6 is, for that exact reason. So you essentially just tack the loss condition of France onto Scotland 6, and that makes that game extremely difficult. Apparently it's absurdly hard, and harder than the 6-6, which is pretty hard to begin with. But anyway, let's move along. I'm going to stop and have a little a sip of my delectable sparkling water. We got plenty of it here ready for the show off to the side. You can see a little bit in shot, I believe, there. Okay, we're going to move along, and we're going to go to the community comments and conversation. So huge, massive thank you to everybody who got involved and provided inputs. We've got a lot of really good inputs this week, and actually, to be honest, a huge amount of what I was going to go through and talk through kind of strategy and everything else actually comes up in these comments. So we'll take our time and we'll go through this. And again, similar to what I did last week, I have kept in, basically everything that people provided that covered this sort of spectrum of tactical and strategic discussion. So if anybody came up with something interesting, it's in here. As per before, there was obviously overlap, and some amount of what people were providing was sort of duplicated and replicated. And in that case, I didn't kind of keep everything that everybody said. So, if I've kind of cut some of your comments short or kind of, only provided some of what you said, that's obviously the reason. But we'll start out here, and this is this name that I struggled with last time. So, Dirklecht to Newman. I wish I knew what that first word was there. But they basically say that I feel that it's the best country in the world when speaking about France, especially for food, literature, and its tradition of striking, which I quite admire as well with the French. But from the narrower perspective of Spirit Island, I like to play against them even if they feel pretty swingy, especially with events. And this will come up all throughout everything that everybody says, of course. So like Sweden and Prussia, they're easier on average, but with higher variance than more difficult adversaries like England or Russia, which I completely agree with. Basically everything that they've said here. And I do also really do enjoy France. I've had many French friends and colleagues over the years. I even speak a small amount of French, so I said I'd take a very small moment here for any of our French listeners, if there are any of you out there, to say je parle juste un petit peu de français, mais j'oublie la plupart de ça depuis l'école parce qu'il y a beaucoup des années. So that's it. For everyone else, you probably won't have a clue what I just said, and I won't be translating it. So there may be one person out there who's half understood my nonsense pigeon French right there, but I said I'd make a very small effort, considering it's the only other language I speak. I don't even speak our national language, Irish, because most people in our country don't. But that is neither here nor there. Let's continue on. Up next, we have a really insightful comment from at MJC041. Big thanks to some really good stuff that's coming in here. They say that France is one of my most played adversaries with 300 plus games logged against them, 95% of those at level 6. So huge amount of games here. That's far more games than even I've played total of Spirit Island. So they've played that many against just France alone. So some collective thoughts they have on the adversary then. So they say, overall, I like them because nearly all spirits have a decent matchup into France. I agree that it's the second easiest matchup, they say, level with Brandenburg Prussia, and that it rewards solid all-round play and it's balanced into most spirit strategies. So offense, defense, control, all viable, while fear victories are also achievable so long as you can prevent the lost condition. So they have similarities with Brandenburg Prussia. So there's, early disruption of the explore, build, ravage cycle works really well. That kind of tempo strategy we talked about before. They have a very similar play clock, according to this user as well. So with BP, you've got 8 turns total because you've got 8 cards, and that's fine. But with France, you need to win by the turn 8 ravage or be overrun by the stage 3 build. So the stage 3, of course, you're hitting 4 land types or 4 lands on each board, and of course, as you start doing adding the extra explorers and everything, once you do a build, you're in big trouble. So that's what they're picking up on here, and they say that these two, along with Sweden, play much faster than the other adversaries. They say also that they're very front loaded, so much of their difficulty comes in the first 2 levels that they're saying here, as I talked about before, sort of first 2, maybe 3 levels, and levels 5 and 6 have comparatively little impact. When playing with events, it's important to not fully rely on disease to prevent the loss condition, because too many events ignore disease, and this becomes one of the key edge cases to play around. And finally, because they're an adversary that represents the player with out the series of options, like we talked about the escalation with the kind of blight versus town stuff, where you place the France 6, the persistent explorers, and doing some things to play around the slave rebellion, which we'll talk about later. They say that I feel they're one of the adversaries where experienced players will have a much easier time than newer players, and I do tend to quite strongly agree with that in particular. They also mention here a couple spirits that work well is Lure, Thunderspeaker, Keeper, Trickster, River, and Bringer Dreams and Nightmares. They say struggles as they can't get rid of buildings or anything, which is a fairly fair point. A little bit of a long comment there. I need to keep myself hydrated. So we have then Salamander coming in next with, whenever I play against France, I tell myself that I'll keep track of how many turns until the Slave Rebellion card comes up and shift things around to maximize it. Then I probably forget to think about it. So I laughed at this because I absolutely fall victim to this. I'd like to consider myself a fairly experienced player, a fairly decent player, in terms of like the previous slide where I don't remember the user's name, was saying, let's go back and read it, I guess, MJC041, was saying that, experienced players will have an easier time against France. I'd like to think of myself as a reasonably experienced player, and it's why I have France near the bottom of my difficulty rating, but I always forget to play around the bloody Slave Rebellion. You put it in the deck, you put it in the event deck. I even place mine face up, which I would encourage other people to do. If you have known information in this game, just place the thing face up. If you're playing against Scotland, we'll talk about that later. They do something with the invader deck. They put the coastal land card in a certain position. Just put it face up in the deck so that you remember. Don't give yourself additional overhead, cognitive overhead when you don't need to do that. But even when I do that, even when I have the Slave Rebellion face up, I'll sometimes be playing a turn and completely forget that that's about to happen in this event, and it's literally staring at me right in the face. So I had to laugh when I read this comment. Moving on then, we've got Greedo102 saying, this is the only adversary I actively avoid. I haven't played them as much as the others, but I don't like the matchup and find it unfun. And they say one of the biggest reasons is blight healing is already not super strong. Weakening it again feels weird, which we kind of talked about at the start of the show. I do agree with that. The instant loss, obviously is a problem as well because there's too many towns and that feels hard to account for. But they do say the one plus is I like how it puts pressure on spirits that can cook with too much time, like stone, and dances up earthquakes, and I very much agree with that. I do like that there's an adversary that pressures you quickly, but in a slightly different way, especially because we talked about Sweden last time. They really pressure you with the blight. France really pressure you, but not with blight, with that town limit. So moving on then, we've got the other name that I absolutely butchered last time. So I can't say that word, _ Maggie 123. That's just a collection of consonants that I just cannot pronounce. Maggie 123. Anyway, let's call you Maggie. Town limit is really annoying to play around, and there are a ton of edge cases without counterplay that can lead to losing the game. So there's that word, edge case. We've talked about it before. Those unfamiliar, edge case essentially means an event that comes and it does something at random, and you kind of, you couldn't account for it, or you didn't account for it, or it just did something that just kind of made a mess of your plans. It's also the reason why I don't play France in double adversary games. So we talked about them at the start in terms of the rules are also problematic here. They say after level 2, it doesn't feel like they impact the game very much. And this is especially bad with level 5, which is that blight slow healing ecosystem. That, the only spirit really hurt by this is wildfire, and it's not really connected to the adversary's team. So they say the difficulty's all over the place, and it's either really easy or really hard, depending on events, and rarely something in between. Quite a few people picked up on that ability in terms of how swingy it was, and you've obviously heard that a couple times, and we'll hear it a few times more here. But again, I kept a few of these comments in because they're slightly different texturally, but yeah, we'll obviously hear that repeated. So next up here we have Sino Han. saying, I dislike France for a lot of reasons. The event deck again can really screw you, and it wouldn't have as much of a problem if it wasn't for three things. So one, it can happen in so many ways. So it's not just that there are a lot of event cards that might cause the loss condition, but these cards will be very different, and you can't play around everything. So good general play can be to allow for one extra town per board, for example, which is one way to sort of think the event might cost one, so how do I play around that? But there can be event cards that will result in 2, 3, even 4 extra towns. So next is then they say that there's no time to act on the information, which is fair. Because of the timing with event cards, and they can be so different in how they screw things up, there's often no point between seeing what the problem could be and actually losing the game, where the player can't make any decisions. And then the last point they say, despite point 1 and 2, they say point 3 is France is really easy, which is, as much as I've been talking about losing to France, it actually rarely happens. So most of the time the wrong event won't come up, is what they say. So they're complaining about all the events that can come up, and then they say most of the time it doesn't actually happen. And I sort of agree here. They do close out. Sorry, one last point is that they say getting good enough to beat France without bad events is super easy. So you just kind of ignore them and just play against them, and it's easy. Getting good enough to play around most of the events is annoying, and getting good enough to play around all of the event combinations is impossible. Which I quite quite laughed at that last point. But yeah, look, ultimately here, responding to this, I think I do certainly agree that there's a whole variety of ways that they can hurt you with events, and obviously because they're events, you very often don't have time to react, which is totally fair as well. But I don't necessarily think that that's annoying or impossible in some ways. I think, yes, as they say, you can kind of just ignore the events and play the game, and some number of time you just won't hit the events and you play against France and it's easy, right? And that's okay. I think ultimately the way I sort of land with France is I'll usually be playing around a variety of things happening. Like they say there, just playing in a way where you assume there's maybe one extra town happening to you in the event is just a good rule of thumb against France. So never sort of relying and trusting that you can get down to the last town. You always want to be sort of 1 or maybe 2 above. And in my playthrough, I picked up on that a couple of times. But there's just having good general play in terms of maybe spreading your bets, not being all in on certain things or certain effects or what have you, and sort of playing just good baseline Spirit Island basics, I think, is what you want to be doing here. So I think that's kind of enough on that one. So up next then we have Kaelin North is saying that my big complaint about France is that it feels like the 3 kids in a trench coat adversary. So there's a lot going on here mechanically, and levels 5 and 6 especially seem prone to being forgotten, which is a different take on this. So additionally, you have to track the town count for the loss condition and the event deck for when Slave Rebellion is going to hit, and forgetting about those can lead to very surprising losses and wins. So Kaelin enjoys playing against France, but it always requires more focus and mental energy than any other adversary, and he says at least for him. My throat's starting to get a little bit sore. It just must be me. I need to learn how to talk again. I don't know what's going on here. It seems like when I'm doing the podcast, I don't know, I'm putting extra emphasis on things, or I'm just talking too much or too fast or too whatever, or maybe I'm just not drinking enough of my sparkling water. Maybe I just need to do some more of that. But yeah, I'll continue in just a moment. Okay. Up next then we have Flimsy Preparation 85. So I hate them, but I will continue to play against them until I have beaten them with every spirit. Nice. Granted, when I did Volcano, it was one of the easiest games I've ever had. So Flimsy here is saying they've obviously got some kind of challenge that they've set until they've beaten them with every spirit, which I totally respect. I'm here for the challenges myself, to be honest. And granted, when I did Volcano, they said, yeah, I love Volcano, and Volcano into France is a pretty good time. So let's keep going. Fluffy Goblin says, I didn't play so much France yet, but I remember playing it with Wandering Voice. After the first Slave Rebellion, most strifed invaders were dead. Excuse me, the board state was all pretty much great, and it was like, but how do I play when there's nothing strifed anymore? So here we start to see strife is coming in, and there's a theme around strife, and we didn't talk about Slave Rebellion yet. I promise we will get there, but Wandering Voice and their strife usage is a big deal and big game against France, so it's no surprise to hear that. Nora Adrenaline is coming in then and says, I really like the mechanic of having an adversary add its own custom event to the event deck. So they're picking up on this. So I feel like there could be more opportunity in that design space in the future. So it gives France a lot of character, and it's so satisfying to pull off a good rebellion. On the other hand, if you don't get a chance to add any strife, the first rebellion can be a bit of a nothing burger. I laughed at this. I've never heard this phrase before. I looked it up online. Nothing burger is apparently a thing. I don't know. I had a good chuckle at that. That definitely tickled my funny bone. So yeah, nothing burger. Fair enough. I mean, look, they're basically saying rebellion can be anywhere from amazing to sort of a nothing burger. So a nothing burger versus a big, double quarter pounder with cheese or something. So I know which one I'd rather have. Okay, so next up we have Social Justice Cleric 7 says, I love and hate the Lost Condition. It always drives me crazy, but overall I appreciate the gameplay variety that comes from having something that is often more important to keep close track of than Blight. So they like, obviously, sort of moving away from thinking about Ravaging and Blight, which is fair. And also it showcases tokens. So before playing France, I tended to see cards that added tokens as being among the least desirable cards, barring specific combos or spirit powers. But France changed my mind on that, not only for France but for other adversaries as well. I really like this one. I totally agree. I think they're the only person who brought up tokens. Strife is obviously a token, but tokens are really good into France. Disease stops them building, strife stops them attacking, of course, and it comes up with the Slave Rebellion. Wild stop them exploring. Exploring is something, if you can stop that and shut that off at the source, it's amazing against France. So yeah, and obviously having some beasts to kind of kill off buildings with beast events and even Badlands to help potentially get rid of those towns is pretty sweet too. So speaking of pretty sweet too, I'm Danish too. That's pretty good timing. I really like France. It makes for an interesting puzzle. So knowing that a good event is coming is really nice, although I tend to massively overvalue Slave Rebellion. So I have to keep myself in check at times, or I just spend all my actions on getting strife and a hand to line up for maximum Slave Rebellion utility, losing sight of any of the actual loss and win conditions. So Danish is getting ahead of themselves here and spending a whole bunch of time doing that, which is if we had to talk to it Slave Rebellion up front, which I should have done, and I'm massively regretting my decision to put it off for so long, because it's just this big build up, and I can't actually speak to the tactical implications. But we're here and we're 41 minutes in, so I certainly won't change my mind now. But they're saying I've been toying with the idea to make the lost condition slightly less bad. So if you are out of towns, use Blight instead. This is really interesting. I want to take a moment to focus on this. So they're basically saying that if you run out of towns, instead of losing on the lost condition right away, start to add Blight instead. So instead of adding a town, you add a Blight. And because France have that kind of duality of difficulty where they're pressuring you on the Blight side, because you can't, you've got that France 5 rule that basically won't let you kind of get it back on the Blight card. So they're pressuring you on that perspective and on the town perspective. So this is a kind of an interesting take. They say they haven't tried it, but curious to hear what other people think. And I really wanted to pick this up because I think that's a super cool idea. Obviously then it means what happens to the lost condition, right? Because your lost condition now doesn't exist anymore, because if you run out of Blight, you lose anyway. So you kind of need to think about what happens to the lost condition there. But that's a kind of a cool idea, and there's obviously nothing really, there's no analog for that in the game as such. The closest is probably HME, where when you place a Blight, you kind of, instead of cascading, you upgrade invaders. So they have something similar-ish to that. But yeah, I don't know, it's kind of, I thought that was pretty would I would be interested in that kind of design space, if that was the direction they took the game. And they say here finally, France 6 is in principle a good rule that pushes the lost condition, but it's fiddly and easy to forget in real life. And clearly here, I absolutely agree. The France 6, especially that fear card rule, they say that especially the part about the fear cards pushing instead of removing, it might be the worst and most annoying rule of any of the 8 adversaries at any level. It's super fiddly, and you don't have a reminder. You know, I really like the little kind of reminder tokens. Again, I think I showed one last time up to the camera. I really like those, you know, and I like to keep them there to remind me of what's happening with the adversary, and it just doesn't have one for that. It has one for the explorer, but it clearly doesn't have one for the event. So if you watch my playthrough, you'll see that I just keep a reminder token, or one of the where are they here? One of my little these things, nice little chunky things. That's a real big upgrade. The token pack 2 gave us these because they were before just, you know, the little cardboardy reminder, or what are they? I don't even know what these effects are. I think that's a reminder, and that's maybe an isolate thing. I don't know. Obviously, some great content there for those of you listening in on the podcast. But I was just showing up the little, the little 6 colored tokens that you get to go along with your presents. So I just stick one of them on the event card anyway. Okay, so up next, I think we've got a couple left. So we've got XER Xerphanox, XER 4NOX. I think France is probably the adversary whose difficulty is most dependent on player level skill, and he was most swingy in true solo. So they're picking up on the player level skill again here, and they're also picking up on true solo, which I don't think anyone else did. So they're saying, for a mediocre player like myself, playing mostly true solo, France is relatively speaking the hardest adversary. And there's a bunch of people that talked about France being like either their most annoying, the one they hated the most, or the one they thought was the hardest. Came up a lot actually, which I was quite surprised about. But again, it is so swingy, and some people just don't really enjoy that and find that, you know, too difficult or whatever. But they say here, like, I've seen the tips: strife, build prevention, killing explorers, killing towns, setting up for the slave rebellion, all of that, but all well and fine in theory. But for someone like me, I just can't keep up with most spirits anyway. And when I do manage, some stupid event comes along. So France feels unforgiving. It's a tightrope, and you have very little margin for error. And they say, I do know that experienced players consider France almost trivial, and I don't doubt them. But is this true in true solo with most spirits? If so, I'm in awe. So, interesting comment here. This gave me a little bit of a pause, and I sort of reflected on some of the words they mentioned in here in terms of experienced players consider France almost trivial. And if we go back to the very start where we had I think it was JMC or JMC 041, I'm not clicking back now, but yeah, whatever that sort of in-depth analysis was at the start, they talk about experienced players having a better time and an easier time than maybe inexperienced players. And I think the difference here is not that experienced players will just, you know, lol their way through the game and just kind of wipe the floor with France, and it will never be close, and they'll never be under any pressure from the loss condition. And I think that's the thing that maybe needs clarification or is possibly misunderstood about this. And I can only speak to myself, I can't really speak for others here, but just to clarify my position on this, I do think France are the second easiest. That's why I put them there. I think they're easier than most of the others, but that does not mean that when I play against France, I go and wipe the floor with them. Absolutely not. And I think a very good example here to showcase what I'm talking about is the playthrough that I went through. We'll talk about it later, but I'll just comment on it here. There was one or two spots in that game where it got really tight, and I was deep in the tying. I was thinking, I'm about to build like 8 towns on this board, and then, you know, the event is going to add 1 or 2 more, and, you know, then the escalation's going to add 1, and I was like super deep. I was going in the maths puzzles, problem solving situation, and I was like right on the edge of the loss condition. And I find a lot of games against France will actually go like that. Even when I say that I find them sort of quote unquote easy, the easy doesn't look like you play the whole game and you've got 5 towns in your pool and you're never under any pressure of the loss condition. Absolutely not. The easy for me looks like most games against France, I'll run very close to that loss condition, but I'll do so in a way that I've carefully managed and planned for, and I've considered most of the options about kind of what can go wrong and what are the edge cases, and I plan and I decide, okay, these are the steps I'm taking, and 80-90% of the time, I won't hit the very worst of those edge cases to make me lose. And I'll just skate close enough and fine enough to the margin of the loss condition, and then I'll turn the corner and I'll win. And that sort of path and trajectory through the game generally is managed well, carefully, and I even though it looks very close, and it does go very close, I'm actually in control of the situation. And that for me is the difference here. And I just wanted to sort of stop it on this comment and sort of speak to that, where when I say it's not trivial, not by any means is it trivial. Like, they will push you hard and you will get close to losing almost every time you play against France. There will be very few games you play against them where you sit with a whole bunch of your towns in the pool and have a great time. So hopefully that sort of clears some stuff up on that one. I think this is the last comment we have here, and it's from NoScene2295. So they dislike playing against France most out of all adversaries. Another one. I'd love someone to do an analysis, but I just get the impression that there are more events that can screw you over against France than any other adversary. And say no more, NoScene. You took the words out of my mouth. You want an analysis? You got one, buddy. So thoughts on best spirits? Spirits that add wilds and or high tempo do well. So unsurprisingly then, Fangs and Keeper from Branch and Claw, and in which they also present France. So France came in the box with Fangs and Keeper. They're some of the strongest matchups to France. So your Strife spirits also help with the Slave Rebellion, and your Dahan movement spirits are fantastic because that also helps with Slave Rebellion as well. So ThunderSpeaker, they say, has an easy time. And they want to give a shout out to Fractured Days, and I like this. So with the event deck manipulation shenanigans it can pull off, it's possible to have multiple Slave Rebellions in a game, or maybe two, maybe three, as opposed to sometimes you only get it once. So what Fractured Days can do, for those of you unfamiliar, they have an innate ability that lets them kind of cycle through the event deck. So they can look at the top card and they can put it on the bottom, so they can kind of dig. So they just as a reminder, Slave Rebellion starts the game under the top three events. Once you draw it, you actually put it back into the deck and you put it under the next three events. So you sort of keep cycling through it and you hit it multiple times. But if you're with Fractured Days, you can kind of cycle through and you can put the cards on the bottom of the deck and you can hit it quicker than other spirits would. So that's pretty cool. And then they say worst spirits then. So ironically, I really struggle with Vengeance and Shroud. So France just actively forbids you from playing those spirits in the way they're intended, and by altering that, it grossly underwhelms their gameplay. And I would sort of partly agree with that. I think Shroud just sort of wants to sit there and keep its towns or buildings at least damaged, and not really get rid of them, so that hurts that a lot. Vengeance, yes, they do have this kind of sit around and do nothing for a while and then fight back, but I think they've got just enough in terms of mid-level or even low-level damage that they can kind of keep that at bay. So I think Vengeance probably does quite okay. So that's it. I'm just very last point here is just I'm just going to list off a bunch of names that we didn't get to their comments. The American Dream 38, Cartographer OK 7358, Inconsequentialis, Neravanine, Protocol Skull, Beta Jin, Squire Monkey, Desicopado, Woe It's Preston, J Moon 33, and Versalius. So thank you all so much for your comments. I didn't get to read them, but they all covered more or less the same space that we just talked about across a range of the difficulty, whether it's easy or hard, talking about the loss condition, talking about the events, the Slave Rebellion, the operations, the rules, the mechanics of them, the fact that they put time limit pressure, and Versalius in particular talked about the adversary combos. I didn't read your comment, Versalius, because you sent it in I think today. I didn't have time to go back and put it in, but it's a 6/6 comment with the adversary combo, so super cool. Go and check that out in particular, because they break down how France interacts with all of the other adversaries. So we will in the future on this show have a 6/6 episode. Be absolutely sure about that. But today, unfortunately, is not that day. Okay, we're 53 odd minutes in. We're going pretty well. I did have a feeling this was going to be another sort of longish breakdown episode, much like Sweden. So that's quite okay. But I do need to keep an eye on the time for for the sake of my wife and her sanity with the kids. So we will continue on, and we'll start to talk a little bit about the kind of analysis from a strategic and sort of tactical breakdown like we did last time out. The France plays very similar to Sweden in a lot of ways that we talked about before in terms of a kind of strategic and tactical type of gameplay. So honestly, if you haven't listened to it, I'm going to float the thing up here. No, it's over on this side. Float this up here somewhere. Go back and listen to the Sweden episode. If you're new and you're only joining the show for the first time, and you like what you hear, go and listen to the Sweden episode. We talk about tempo, we talk about card flexibility, we talk about sort of drafting and growth and all of that, and reclaiming, and there was a bunch of stuff in there that I think all pretty well translates into France. But there's some sort of other nuances here that I think are important, or more important against France, that we'll pick up on here. So again, we talk about tempo, but against France, it's even more important to think about being proactive. So when we talked before about this kind of range of sort of one to the other, in this case we have the very good side of things, which is being proactive. So something you really want to be doing against France is being proactive. Now, what does that mean? Well, I can break it down sort of in terms of proactive versus reactive. Most people will be familiar with the terms here, but being proactive means really thinking and planning and getting ahead of what's going to happen. This can happen in a whole bunch of ways, and there's lots of different ways in the game. There's mechanics, there's approaches, there's all sorts that can matter here. You can think about, for example, being proactive in the fast phase. So that's getting ahead of France before they build. For example, if they've just put a bunch of explorers in a land, if I can do something fast and get in there and move them out, well, that's proactive, right? Obviously before the build happens. Even stopping those explorers getting there in the first place, maybe wild, maybe isolate, that's a proactive play. But even it can be done with slow powers as well. It doesn't necessarily mean I have to be fast. So we saw again in the playthrough one such example of, I think it was the first turn of the game with Wounded Waters, and I was thinking about my innate, and I was thinking about I played one card, and again I was looking at the map and I was thinking, okay, I'm in this land and I'm looking at the invader cards that can come out. So there's, let's say, 3 terrain types that can land right now. And I know of those terrain types, basically one of each of them is going to be a double explorer, right? Because I look at the board and I can see that clearly here, if it's sands, there's a sand right beside me, that can be a double explorer. There's a mountain and there's a wetland. So I kind of was planning out on what each of those invader cards could look like, and thinking proactively, well, okay, let's find a way to deal with a double explorer as opposed to a single explorer. So then again, I was looking at my innates and I was thinking, right, one innate is deal a single point of damage. So that could kill one explorer. But the other innate is push 2 explorers. So in that case, you're kind of thinking and you're weighing up your options. And, I was planning my elements and things like that as part of that process. So, again, that's proactive thinking. That's not waiting for explorers to show up and then reactively sort of having to push them out. Or I did talk about, the fast phase kind of being able to pull them out, as a proactive play. And then I just called it reactive. So that sounds a little contradicting there, but just to clear up what I mean, you're thinking in advance if you can. Proactive is being trying to get there ahead of the thing, not waiting until something happens, not waiting until the build happens, not waiting until you run really low to your town loss condition to start doing something about it. So proactive is getting there first. And then some examples of reactive thinking, I just basically listed them, I think. So waiting until after a build happens, very reactive. Generally for me, defending a land is a reactive thing to do. We talked about obviously loads of times, and I'll say it probably every episode, that defend is one of the strongest things you can do in this game. It's certainly strong against France, but if you're relying too much on defend, you are allowing the towns to build. you're allowing the board to go to hell just a little bit, and then you're defending and trying to clean up with your sort of hand counter-attacking, and that can go wrong. That's a sort of a reactive measure. It's a reactionary way of playing, and if you rely too heavily on that, you'll find yourself in trouble. Strife is another good example. It's the same sort of thing as defend, but again, it's reactionary because you need to let the building get out there to be able to strife it, of course. And then blight removal. Clearly, blight removal is massively reactive because you're letting stuff get on the board, then you're trying to clean it up later. And against France, of course, we said that's a no-go. The other thing I mentioned just here, I wrote down as a note, is panic drafting is another thing as well. So if you're sort of letting the thing go to hell and then you're panicking and you're going and trying to grab major powers to solve your problems, I mean, that'll happen, right? It happens in loads of games, but again, that's a reactionary measure. It's not really thinking ahead. So that's one thing. The other thing in terms of very good as well is board management. So I just sort of went through a little bit about board management there, but I'll just kind of make a few quick notes here. So control versus removal is one thing. Do I push invaders versus do I kill them? Clearly here you want to kill them rather than push them. But again, we talked before about tempo in the previous episode and how it can be easier to push instead of kill. You know, it can be quicker, it can be easier, it can be cheaper. So again, but if you do too much of that and you spend too much and invest too heavily in just moving things around against France, you'll find yourself in trouble because you're not getting rid of the plastic. And if you're not getting rid of the plastic, then eventually the towns will run out and eventually they'll hit a build in a land full of explorers, and then all of your things will convert. To that effect, grouping invaders versus keeping your lands empty. So these are two things that kind of come up a lot in games of Spirit Island, right? You group all the invaders into a land and you make a problem land and you deal with it later. Fine, all well and good. You'll do it against France, certainly, but you need to be a little bit of aware for multiple reasons. One, if it explores and if it builds and you've got 5 explorers in there, you've got big problems. The other thing as well is the empty lands paradigm I talked about before. I think I talked about this before. Maybe I didn't. Well, I certainly talked about it with the adversary panel. If you've got a whole bunch of empty lands on your board and your board is looking super clean, great news. You know, you've probably got a bunch of towns in the pool and that all looks really good until a stage 3 card hits and you go explore, and then you start just throwing explorers all over your board and your empty lands very quickly start to fill up again. So being aware of where your empty lands are and how you're managing them and perhaps trying to split them across different terrain types is something very important there. Otherwise, in terms of board management, your hand positioning, you know, again, this will matter against any adversary, of course, especially if you're thinking about defending and moving your hand accordingly. But here we've got the Slave Rebellion, where ultimately you'll find out that it matters at some stage in this episode. Now we're getting there, trust me. But again, obviously, you know, there's other reasons for the hand positioning to matter. You know, where your Dahan are relative to your explorers sometimes matters for things like fear cards and stuff like that. And finally, I'll just make a very clear note of it here. The escalation, again, I mentioned it already in terms of managing your terrain types and having the terrain where maybe you have both options when you hit an escalation. Maybe I can blight or maybe I can add a town. That can be something pretty important. Another thing here to talk about in terms of strategies then for a game, so this is quite a sort of a long-term thought in a game, is game progression. And I have here game progression being good. You want to progress your game and you really want to be thinking about what's your win condition and how you're getting there versus durdling around. And I wrote the word durdling and I said I'm going to say it anyway, and I've no idea how many of my listeners and viewers will be familiar with the term. I googled it to make sure I wasn't going crazy. So this is the term that gets used in Magic all the time, and I know I'm sure a lot of fans will also be people who've played Magic before. But durdling, I think I saw written that it had its origin in World of Warcraft, but it sort of means just sort of doing things things but not really doing anything, sort of taking game actions but not really advancing yourself towards a win condition. So in Magic, you could be durdling around. Maybe you're doing a combo deck and you're sort of just moving things and you're doing actions but you're not really getting anywhere, and then you sort of don't really win and you just durdle for ages without winning. But there's a whole bunch of ways that could be applied to Spirit Island as well. If you're sort of fiddling around and moving pieces around the board but you're not gaining any fear is one example. You're not getting anywhere. Finder and Pats Unseen is a spirit that's famous for durdling around. It kind of just moves stuff about the place, but it doesn't get anywhere near winning the game. If it's not killing things and it's not gaining fear, you can move things around forevermore. You'll just eventually lose. So clearly here what we're talking about is, against France, you have to have an eye for fear generation, as I just said, but also getting rid of the plastic. Yes, that's all well and good again, but if you haven't gained enough fear and you aren't getting towards your win condition, ultimately you will lose, because the stage 3 cards will start to hit thick and fast and you won't be able to stop all those builds and you will run out of towns. So that's something to be super aware of here. So stopping right now, because I've just hit a key point of the episode, and that is event awareness. We heard it from I think it was No Scene before in the comments, how they would like to hear an event breakdown and analysis. Well, you asked for it and you got it, No Scene. So here, finally, the last element of game strategy and tactics that I want to talk about is your awareness of events. Clearly, here we've heard about it a bunch from a whole bunch of people in the comments. And it's true. You need to be aware of what events can do for you or can do to you as part of this game. That's a general principle, of course, and sort of the more advanced players and the better you get at this game, the more you'll be able to anticipate how an event can hurt you. But it's particularly true against France, and I decided to do a breakdown and just have a little bit of a look of what are some of the kind of stats and things about what those events look like. So I'll do this for France. I probably won't do it again. This is kind of quite a deep dive into events because they matter most against France, and of course they have their own custom events. So we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive here. I have kind of 5 categories of events that we're going to look at. There are 62 total events, including the Slave Rebellion, and that does not include, of course, I think there were 3 or 4, something like that got removed as part of being retired from the game. So clearly they don't count here. We're talking about 62 events that are currently active in the game. It will usually be 61 if you're not playing against France, but against France you have that additional card, and I've spread them into 5 categories, from worst to best, in terms of worst news to best news for you, the player, and I've kind of grouped them up, and we've done a little bit of an analysis, and we've got a little bit of data to look at here. So the first category among these, I've got them beside myself, so I'm going to be able to kind of go through and have a look here, is cards that essentially add towns to the board. Now that can happen in different ways. It doesn't necessarily mean literally pick a piece of plastic and put it there, but this essentially means that any card which will increase the amount of towns on the board relative to what you thought it would be. So what does that mean? Well, let's dig into it. So there are 25, by the way, of these cards. So that's roughly 40% of the whole deck when you draw an event will be one of these cards. I've subcategorized these basically into 4, and I'm going to put a graphic on the screen either now or in a minute, where I sort of show what they look like. So there's within that 25 cards, there are essentially 4 subtypes here. First subtype is I'm dropping them on the thing here beside me. It's basically something that adds or builds a town. So either adds one or it forces you to build, and you essentially don't have a choice in the matter. You don't really have any agency. You don't get to choose kind of yes or no. You have to do it. One example is, coastal towns multiply. Add a town to a coastal land adjacent to a coastal town. It just tells you to do it, and that's it. There's one clear point here and a caveat that most people will be aware of, but I'll point it out now. obviously with these cards, and that card is one example, and probably the vast majority, there will be some condition on these cards, right? So in the Coastal Towns Multiply, of course, that's a healthy island effect. If I'm on the blighted island side, that won't hurt me, right? So I couldn't do the full deep dive and go into sort of when and how and which conditions and all that. I obviously didn't do that because that would be way too heavy and boring, but I've essentially grouped these into these 13 cards that I'm talking about now that either add or build with no choice. They, you could essentially go and hit pretty much any of these and it not matter in your game because you don't have the qualifying condition. But one of the conditions on the card does this effect. So Coastal Towns Multiply, there's one in here, for example, where cultures mix and clash, where it says, a condition of the number of the hand versus the number of buildings. If your buildings outnumber the hand by 2 or more, you replace the hand with the town. So again, there's big conditions on some of these, but if you hit them, you have no choice. You just have to do it. There's a whole bunch of stuff where some of them will make you force you to build, as I say, and some of them will just force kind of to place a town. So Provincial Seat is one example where it says on a healthy island on each board, choose a land with a city, build there. If you don't have a city on your island, you don't have to do it, and so on. So that's fine. And clearly here that could also force you to build a city instead of a town, but you get the idea. So that's 13 of those. Next up then we have 4 cards that give you a choice in the matter, and these are things like Missionaries Arrive. It's a choice event. You kind of have to pay for it with some if you don't want to do the town adding part, but you may not be able to. So this is essentially just 4 cards that there's some amount of optionality in there. You have some amount of agency as the player, whether or not you're able to meet the condition to do it. Like, you might not have any sun or energy, so you might have to do the missionaries, and there's other things like, for example, Farmers Seek to the Hand for Aid is one of the best examples. Everyone knows this infamous card. It's probably the worst card in the whole deck, and it absolutely wrecks you against France, as well as pretty much every other adversary. But again, you've got some amount of agency in terms of whether or not that triggers. So that's those. Then we've got a condition of 5 cards here that basically make towns harder to remove, and what this means is, for example, it might stop you stop the ravage. So if you've got to set up a thing where you've got, okay, there's 2 towns in there, I'll set up a ravage, I've got 2 to hand to counterattack, that's 2 towns gone off the board and back in my pool before I hit the build step. And then you might hit one of these cards that says, for example here, Temporary Truce. In lands with the hand, 1 to hand and 1 town do not participate in ravages, and that can happen all over your board. So again, that can quote unquote add towns to your pool. It's not actually adding or add towns to the board. It's not actually adding a town to the board, but it's stopping it being removed, and thus when you get to your build step, it's not in the condition that you planned for it to be in. So there's 5 of them. There's 1 or 2 others, for example, that do stuff like tight-knit communities. For the rest of the turn, towns have +1 health. So again, you maybe set up a situation where you have 1 to hand and 1 town in a ravage, and that now no longer counterattacks and kills the town. Or maybe you had a slow power that dealt like 2 damage and you were going to kill a town with it, but now that no longer kills it. So you get the idea there. Finally, then we have 3 of these effects, and this one is really important, and just to be aware, there are 3 of them in the deck, and that is stopping the build. So we have 3 effects in here. 2 of them are called Irregular Outbreaks. 1 is called Lingering Plagues, and they essentially say ignore disease during builds this phase. So if you're relying on disease to stop the builds, which is a super strong thing potentially into this adversary, just be aware that there are 3 of those in the deck that essentially say ignore disease, and you have to build anyway. So that can be a real big pain and hit you really hard. So that's that. That's 40% of your deck. Big trouble, big bad news if you hit some of them at the wrong time. Up next, we have the next worst effect, I would say, and that is adding explorers. Also, really, really bad news, as we've heard, against France. So of this, I counted that there were 11 cards. And by the way, I should also, before I get into this, I've done an analysis where I sort of look at the whole deck, and I look at every single card I only counted once. I'm not essentially doing overlapping effects and counting things multiple times. So what does that mean? To be clear, there could be an effect on a card now, for example, or there could have been an effect on one of those town ad cards that potentially adds explorers, just as an example. But I didn't count it twice, right? I'm only counting the card once. I'm essentially treating it as if when you're playing a game of Spirit Island and you're about to draw a card, which one of these effects or which one of these groups can that card fall into? I'm not treating it as if it falls into kind of multiple groups, you know. So there will clearly be situations here where you know, I've got one of my groups is adding blight. That's going to be after this. There are going to be some cards that maybe add town but also add blight, or maybe add explorers but also add blight. But I haven't counted them twice. So as I say, I've kind of gone from worst to best. So if it falls into the town category, it's going in the town pile. It doesn't matter if it also adds blight. The worst thing it does is adds town, so it's going in that one. So just so we're aware here, all of our percentages essentially will total and add up to 100%. That's kind of the way I've treated this. Hopefully that makes sense. So anyway, back to the cards. So we've got these cards that are going to add explorers. There are 11 of them total. And that's going to make up 18% of the deck. So when you go to draw a card, you have an 18% chance, assuming a full deck, of course, but again, we won't get into the math behind that, but just assume, generally speaking, on average, you've got an 18% chance of hitting one of these cards. And they break down as follows. I have 8 cards here, and these 8 cards are going to be the first category, which is either add or move explorers around the board, but not necessarily in the land you're exploring into. So these can be, you know, sometimes it will be related to the land, sometimes you'll have a choice, sometimes you won't. But this is essentially just either adding, as I say, mostly adding, but I think there's one or two that just move explorers in here. And, you know, for example here, distant exploration actually... Yeah, so distant exploration was kind of an oddball, in fact, but this card says, during the explore step, invaders explore at +1 distance. So this is a card that essentially says, I was expecting that, you know, I've pocketed in that corner, for example, so that's not a set of explorers that I had to deal with. But now you hit this card and now your pocket doesn't work anymore and you do explore into that land. That may have belonged in the second pile here. Now that I look at it, it was the one sitting on top, so I've kind of ruined my own analysis slightly. But essentially that's saying, no, actually it doesn't. Now that I think about it, the second pile doesn't belong in the second pile. I was right the first time. I should always trust myself. But yeah, so that's that. There's other effects in here, for example, like investigation of dangers, add 1 explorer to a land without invaders or Dahan. So that's, again, you know, sometimes you'll have a choice on that. A lot of times you won't. A lot of times that might just be a single solitary land on your board and you just go, okay, I'll just put 1 explorer into that land, and then maybe that might hit on the explorer and it might hurt you on the extra build step, or maybe it'll just be a random explorer you throw on the board and it won't matter. So that's generally the gist of those 8 cards there. A sort of a variety of may or may not come up as part of the next explorer, but hopefully not, and hopefully have a bit of agency in them. But then you've got these cards, which are 3 cards. And these cards are of the category explore with an extra explorer this turn. So there's 3 of them: Wave of Reconnaissance, the Frontier Calls, and Mapmaker's Chart the Wild, which is a famous one. And basically all 3 of those cards say, when exploring, add 1 additional explorer to each land that they explore. They basically all say different variants of the exact same thing. Well, Frontier Calls basically adds +1 explorer to lands without buildings, but that's where this kind of matters most. So slightly different variant of it, but it'll matter against France. And Mapmaker's explore actions add +1. So 2 of them are +1 no matter what. The other one is +1 if the town doesn't have buildings, which is kind of almost the worst case scenario anyway. So that's them, 3 of them. Again, we talked about with the add town stuff, the stopping the build. 3 cards in the stop the build, super important. And here with the adding explorers, 3 of them that add an extra explorer as part of the explore step. That's those. Next up then is a category. So this is going to be a third of 5 categories, and this is going to be cards that add blight. Now, adding blight is bad. We talked about it already a bunch. We don't want to add blight against France, but we're not necessarily losing the game. We will eventually, and it's hard to get it back on the card, but really our towns and our explorers are our main concern. But still, adding blight is a problem. So I've got three kind of subcategories under this. So there's 16 total cards, by the way, here that add blight. And again, as I say, sort of overlapping things. There's not a total of 16 cards in the deck that does it, but there's 16 cards here that at least didn't fall into either of those two first categories. And these are a total of 26% of the deck. Three subcategories here. So first subcategory is going to be I can sacrifice presence to prevent the ability. So, everyone will be familiar with this. It comes up quite a lot in the game where, here's one example. It's the card Invaders Surge Inland, but we're talking about the Blighted Island effect, which is Widening Destruction. And it says, on each board, add a blight to a land adjacent to buildings. Spirits may prevent this on any or all boards by destroying 2 presence from each board to be protected. There is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them, as I say. They all more or less say some flavor of that. Sacrifice presence to prevent the blight add. We know them well, and that's kind of that. Basically, after that, then we have another 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And these cards essentially give you a different type of prevention or a different type of choice. So it's not sacrifice and presence, but it might be, for example, Numinous Crisis, which is another very famous card, which you don't just remove one blight, you remove all the blight. So that gives you the option of just essentially flipping the blight card and, of course, gaining infinite energy and winning the game. So, you can either win the game with Numinous Crisis, or you can do the other thing. So that's kind of one choice with that card. But then we've also got, of course, things like New Species Spread. That came up in one of our previous playthroughs, where it can kind of, add things, or you can pay the moon cost to avoid the blight. There's another famous one in here, which is Lesser Spirits Imperiled. And if you don't hit the threshold or the choice event, essentially, if you can't pay for it, you've got a potential blight removal situation going on, or a blight not blight removal, but what is it, removing card from the blight and putting it into the box, so essentially losing blight. But if you can, of course, you can gain 1 permanent element for the rest of the game, which also more or less reads like win the game as well. So Numinous Crisis and Lesser Spirits Imperiled, they both win you the game, but otherwise then you've got a whole bunch of other situations that you can do and choices in there as well. One of them is you can pay energy as opposed to paying sack presence. Finally, then the last of these is two cards, and these are cards that don't give you any choice at all. They just say add blight, full stop, and that is Remnants of a Spirit's Heart. If you can't pay for, where's that at the bottom, 1,000 Small Struggles, it's got some condition and it just adds a blight without asking. And then this other card, Civic Engagement, this is the card on its Blighted Island part. It's Life's a Web, Torn Asunder, and again, based on the number of blight on your board, it forces you to add blight. So that's that one. Next up, we've got some neutral situation here. So we've got the Switzerland of France, and that is our 4th card and our 4th category, and it's neutral cards. We've got 2 of them, nice and easy. It's 3% of all the total cards in there. Overconfidence and Visions Out of Time. 2 cards that don't really have any effect against France. They do some stuff like maybe some slightly extra ravage effects or something like that, but it's not really necessarily related to the core mechanics of them, so not really worth talking about there. And then finally, we have some good news, which is 8 cards that remain, 8 events that remain, and that's 13% of the deck. So 13% of the time when you go to the deck against France, you're probably going to get some good news, and let's have a look at what that good news looks like. 6 of these cards are going to give you options that remove towns from the game. So of those 6, one of them is Years of Little Rain, so that's another one that says win the game, so that's easy. So you can win the game, one of those 6, and then of the other 5, then you can do things like Far Off Wars, Touch the Island, which is in a particular land you get to destroy half of the towns and stuff like that. You have for example Cities Rise, which is it's hard to call Cities Rise good news, but sometimes against France it can be. So on each board in the land with the most towns, replace 2 towns with 2 cities. Very often absolutely backbreaking, but sometimes against France. This will be good news. So I'm struggling here to get you good news, folks. But one of your 6 town removal cards is going to be Cities Rise. There's a couple more in there that do it as well. After that, then we have one card that prevents a build from happening. So bureaucrats adjust funding. This is also a conditional effect here. So sometimes this is bad, but sometimes it's good. So if your board has 9 or more buildings on it, so if your board has kind of gone to hell a little bit, build cards skip the highest numbered matching land. But if your board looks really nice and you've got 3 or fewer buildings, it's going to cause an additional build action, which may obviously put additional towns on the board as well. So that one is potentially good news. And that leaves us finally, after all of that analysis, with the Slave Rebellion. No, I didn't see that. Maybe it didn't pick up on it. There it is. Let's get that. I'll just put it up on the screen. What am I doing? So Slave Rebellion. This is the one that I should have talked about an hour and 21 minutes ago at the very start of the episode. I should have said, welcome to everyone. Slave Rebellion reads like follows at the start of the episode, and that would have made my life significantly easier. But, here we are. So let me have a drink and let me prepare myself before I speak about this fantastic event that everybody knows and everybody loves. Get our sparkling water here, of course. Take a little deep breath or two. Okay. Slave Rebellion. Custom event for France only, as we say. Let's read it top to bottom. Adversary event, include only if specified, discard and redraw if not playing against the Kingdom of France. Yeah, I just keep this in my deck. I actually put this face up in my deck. I shuffle it in every time I play with events. I don't put this in the box or anything. I just keep it in the event deck, and if I come across it when I'm playing against another adversary, you might see it happen to me on one of my playthroughs. I obviously just flip it over and I draw another one. So this is stages 1 and 2. On the top, it says small uprising. On each board, add a strife to a town. After finishing the event card, draw another one, and then we'll put this back in the deck under the top 3. So that's the first effect, is add a strife to a town. Okay, seems straightforward enough. Let's look at the stage 3. This is usually once later in the game, if the game goes long enough and you hit this. Now you do, on each board, destroy a town, and then add a strife to any 2 buildings, towns or cities. Then every invader takes 1 damage per strife it has. And then after finishing this, you draw another one, but this gets discarded. So both times, whether it's the first iteration or the second iteration, you're going to also draw another event, because this is good news. So they also have to give you the bad news. the whole, however many, 87% of bad news that's in the deck. That we talked about in our analysis. So you got to get one of them, but this is you're basically you're drawing the bad one is eating your spinach, and this is the kind of the cookies that you get as a benefit. So this is essentially going to say then at the end of the card it says aid the uprising. So after you do either the other 2 things, usually either destroying a town or usually putting a bunch of strife on stuff, then you do invaders with strife take 1 damage per Dahan present, and that's all invaders on the whole island. Any invader with strife takes 1 damage per Dahan present, and then you add 1 Dahan per building that this destroys. And this is the reason why so many people in the comments talked about getting planned with your Slave Rebellion, getting out there, getting the strife onto the board, moving your Dahan around, setting up, and then timing it perfectly with this, because all invaders with strife take 1 damage per Dahan present, and that's each one, and then each of them get the benefit of the Dahan even if they're in the same land. So for argument's sake, let's say I have a land with 2 Dahan and 3 towns. If I've gotten a strife on each of those towns, either from this or from a different effect, it doesn't matter. When I trigger that bottom thing, each of those towns is going to take 2 damage because there's 2 Dahan in there. So we go 2, 2, 2, kill all 3 of them, and then we get to add a 3 Dahan essentially into the land, right? Isn't that how it works? So add 1 per town this destroys. Yeah, So we just put a whole bunch of Dahan out on the board as well. So it's amazing. Clearly this is super strong, right? This is nuts. The first stage is 1 and 2. So if you hit this early in the game, obviously the first time you hit this, it's going to be on that stage is 1 and 2 situation. For the most part, there are some adversary combos, I think, where you can hit this potentially on the stage 3 first. That might happen. I can't quite remember. But ultimately, usually what you're going to have is on each board, you go strife, both of them die, you get 2 building kills, you get 2 extra to hand, and then you put that back in the deck, and then a lot of times you never see it again, you never have to worry about it. That's your kind of average case, I would say. And for the most part, if you're not leaning into this, or you're not, using one of those strife users like, Trickster or Voice, that's it, right? You just kind of, you set your game up, you make a plan where when this is going to hit, and you kind of solve your land. You essentially get to a situation where ideally you go maybe 1 explorer builds on the previous turn, and you've got a land that has a single explorer and a single town. It's about to ravage. There's your slave rebellion, and you go bam, strife on the town, strife on the other town, and then you kind of just solve your ravage that way, and then you're fine. So a lot of the games, that's what this looks like. Ultimately for me, in my opinion, vast majority of the games I've played look like that. I haven't actually played that many games where I've really lent into this. I've done that thing again. God, I'm so sorry. I forgot to plug my my light back in. That's just two situations in a row. Let me just go ahead and do this. Apologies, folks. That's 2 playthroughs or two sessions in a row where that's happened. This time around, I mentioned it at the top when I was messing around and I was fiddling around with lighting and settings on my camera and all that sort of stuff. So I had my light set up, mounted up on the bracket over there, and then I moved it over and I mounted it up there. But when I did that, I unplugged it. I forgot to plug it back in. So anyway, enough of all that. Where was I? I was talking about the Slave Rebellion. I was essentially saying, yeah, look, the vast majority of the games I've played have not been really centered around this card at all. For me, it just feels like something tacked on at the side of the game. You kind of can take it or leave it type of thing. Clearly, it's a very powerful effect if you play around that, and especially that stage 3 effect is crazy strong. Somebody mentioned at the top, and I'll pick it up again here, so the timing of this, the way this works, assuming you haven't hit any event in the game that's kind of altered, the way some events will say things like, or fear cards will say things like, skip the next explore, skip the next build, those kind of effects. Assuming you haven't hit one of them, under normal circumstances, the timing of this card works where this event gets drawn on the turn that your last stage 1 card and your last stage 2 card are ravaging, right? So let's just clarify what that means. So in the deck, usually you have stage 1 cards, 1, 2, 3. Then you've got stage 2 cards, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 7 cards total. So on the third card on the third card when it ravages, and on the 7th card when it ravages, both of those times, and where you draw this before that happens. So from a ravage perspective, what I talked about with the strife ad and sort of solving your lands, that's what you're thinking about. It's the 3rd card ravaging and the 7th card ravaging. That corresponds, by the way, to the 4th turn and the 8th turn of the game. So turn 4 and turn 8 are when you draw this card as your event. But what's even more important, so that matters, but what's even more important is this card, the second time around, so that stage 2 card that I talked about, the last stage 2 card, when it ravages, when you do your last stage 2 ravage, what comes right after that? It's your stage 3 build. So that's your first stage 3 card is right about to build, right around the corner from this. So you better hope that this gives you some big payoffs and really helps. And that's the thing, it actually usually does. So we heard from the people talking in the comments about how you really want to try get this to get you over the line. It's almost like a last gasp push. And part of that is cool. Part of it ultimately for me is maybe not so cool. I have sort of mixed feelings on this card, right? I think it's a cool design space. I think I love that this is a custom card for France. Somebody else mentioned that in the comments. They said how this is, it's a really cool design space, and I'd love to see it more. I'd love to see that in future content, that another adversary could have its own event card. I think that's really cool. But what I don't love is sort of some of what I was getting at there. It's very deterministic for the most part. You know when it's coming. Unless you're like me and the other user who just keep forgetting about it, but usually you'll know and you'll be planning for it in advance. And if you're Trickster or any of the other Strife users or some of the others, you're really strongly playing around this card. And I'm not sure I love that, in all honesty. It can be very swingy. It can be end the game, or it can be, like I said, just get rid of 2 towns, maybe solve two ravages. In my playthrough, it didn't even solve ravages. In my playthrough, it was absolutely meh. It was just kill 2 towns, and that's it. I've even seen it where I completely forgot to play around this card, and it was like it didn't even kill towns. I didn't even have anywhere on the board where this could kill a town. I think maybe the previous playthrough that I played, that I talked about, the Phantom playthrough that I never posted, when I played Mud and Roots into France. I think when I played that game, on at least one of the boards, I just added a thing into a town where there was only 1 to hand in the land, and I didn't even get the kill. So that's clearly, obviously, very poor planning. That's poor play on my part, but it can happen, is my point, right? And I don't love something that swingy in a game, in all honesty, and I don't love, as I say, the fact that this ends a lot of the time just ends the game right before the meat and potatoes of the end game, which is your stage 3 cards. This just kind of happens, the game ends, and it's like, yeah, okay. So I think there are ways that this could be improved. Just very finally on this, I think, as printed, I think one small change, and I think I remember hearing on the KSP, somebody's commenting on the KSP, or maybe it was actually one of the guys, John or Ryan, were talking about something they read, where they saw that some people prefer to play this card where you randomize it in the deck, so you don't put it in under the top 3, you put it in under the top 2 to 4 cards. So you essentially sort of, you probably take a couple of cards and you kind of shuffle it in, and then you put it face down, obviously at that point, not face up, in your deck, and then you don't know exactly which turn it's going to hit on. So it could be under the top 2 or it could be under the top 4. I quite like that, actually. I think that's a nice sort of house rule sort of variance to play on this. The reason I don't love that in particular, and just doing it that way, is I don't really love house rules all that much. And I talked about this, I think, already, but things like even scenarios throw the game off. They throw the game balance. It's not the game as intended. It's not really the way it was printed. And clearly in scenarios case, yes, they're printed, of course, but they're different. And I don't love different because I'm a bit sort of anal and OCD kind of about things like that. And I don't hate it or anything, but I wouldn't do it because that's not the way it's supposed to be done. So that's not a great solve to just house rule it in a sense. But if it had been written like that and printed like that, I'd love it way more. I think that would be great. The other thing that I think, and if we're talking about this design space and maybe future content, I think what could be really cool is having a custom event that isn't deterministic, and there's some amount of variance on the card. So there's not just the stage 1 and the stage 2 and 3 stuff, but roll a dice, do X. If this card had been printed like, roll a dice on a 1, 2, or 3, do maybe the top part. On a 4 or 5, maybe do something else, and then on a 6, do the big rebellion. Something like that, where you're unlikely to hit the big rebellion, but sometimes you do, and then maybe you've got to do nothing or something like that, or maybe a negative effect. So some sort of variance involved there. I think if that had been baked into that card, I think that I'd enjoy that quite a lot more. So that's kind of it in terms of that. I have some cards and effects here that that I'm going to go through. I did this last week, and I see we're going a little bit late, and my wife is probably downstairs cooking dinner and trying to clean kids and do all sorts of stuff. So I don't want to spend too long digging into the card analysis. I have a bunch of cards on the table in front of me, but we're going a little long, so I'll move quite quickly through them. I will go top to bottom. I've got 9 categories again here, but I'll spend a lot less time on each category. So we're starting out again. We've got this kind of very good to not so good kind of scale here, but again, quite quickly through them. The first is damage and removal, but something that can do it in multiple ways. So getting rid of multiple invaders, and ideally in flexible ways. So I've got one card here, Scour the Land, one of the best cards in the deck against France. Clearly here, you get to kill a bunch of towns, you kill all explorers, all that sort of stuff. So I had found this with Mud in my France playthrough, that the Phantom one, and it was amazing. It was just like I cleared like 2 lands or something with it towards the end of the game, and it was completely broken. So that's a super strong card. You've got a couple like Poison Dew in there as well that kind of kill all explorers. You've got Veil the Night's Hunt, which is a kind of the hand deals damage to a different invader, which often isn't that strong, but it's super strong here. And then I gave a major as an example, which is Sweep into the Sea. Again, it's kind of getting rid of all towns and all explorers, so super strong there. Next up is going to be Invader Control. So that was more damage and removal. Similar vein, but this time for control. Ways to control multiple explorers or multiple pieces of plastic. You've got something like Entrancing Apparitions. Really good card against France. You get to gather up to two explorers here. Song of Sanctity is another one that moves multiple explorers or moves all explorers. Call to Isolation. Really strong, but it's also flexible. So I didn't mention with Veil the Night's Hunt, the reason why it's also so strong is it can move to hand. So Call to Isolation, clearly again, for the same reasons it was good against Sweden, same reasons it's good here. You get to move to hand as well as move explorers around and kind of control your builds that way. Flow Like Water, Reach Like Air is a major that I put into this category because it's actually a really cool card. I don't use it all that much, but I really like it. I think it's an amazing card, but not so amazingly strong, but amazingly fun and interesting. And I do think that's sort of a stronger card than probably the community at large would give it credit for. So up next then we have Explorer Prevention. So in this case, this is, your wilds, your isolate to the world. So the first two were kind of more on the very good, the absolute best thing you can do. We've got a whole bunch of effects now that are coming up that are generally good, not necessarily the best, but they're good. And here in this case, Explorer Prevention is excellent if you hit it. But the thing about these cards is often you're kind of guessing, which is why it's not necessarily the best thing you can do. But there's some stuff in here like Sucking Ooze, which lets you isolate, but it also lets you generate fear. So that gives you your flexibility, and fear is something good as well. I put a couple in here like Razor Sharp Undergrowth and Treacherous Waterways, which are ways to add wilds or deal with explorers, or both in the case of Razor Sharp Undergrowth, which is not a card that sees a lot of play really, and it's not very strong, but particularly good against France. And I put in Strangling Firevine as the major for this category here, which again, don't really love the card, don't use it very much, but it is super strong at the France. Up next then we've got Build Prevention. In this case we're talking about disease, and as we talked about before, this can hurt you with events, so be careful, use carefully and tread with caution, but it is obviously very strong. I've got a couple here like Thriving Choke Fungus, which can also get you some Badlands, and that's a nice kind of duality there. Inflame the Fires of Life, another strong card against France. You get to potentially add a disease, or you add a strife to kind of play into the Slave Rebellion, or both if you have the elements. And one other card I put here as well, super strong into France, is a kind of a medium card, but really good here. It's Death Falls Gently from Open Blossoms. And you've probably noticed by now, I'm not just throwing out every time like Vigor the Breaking Dawn, Indomitable Claim, or whatever as S tier majors. We all know what the S tier majors are, and yes, for the most part they're good against everybody, so it's not really interesting for me to throw those at you here. But Death Falls I think is really nice, and especially if you can hit that threshold and kind of put disease into multiple lands, super strong here. So up next, then we've got another good effect, which is preparing for the slave rebellion. So I sort of put it about in the middle here. So it's the 5th of 9, and in this case, I've got a couple of examples. Promises of protection is one. So this lets you move the hand, which is good for slave rebellion. But you can also use it throughout the game as your kind of pseudo defend in a land and kind of clear out some towns that way. And I put a Pent-up Calamity, which is sort of similar. This is a very strong card. It's certainly closer to S tier than maybe a lot of the ones I would put in here, but in this case you can use it during the game. You can put, for example, disease to stop a build, which we said was really good. You can put a strife to stop a ravage. You can put a strife to prepare for the slave rebellion, or you can also just deal a whole bunch of damage and kill off some towns. So super strong into France. Up next, then, we've got fear. So we said fear against Sweden, not necessarily so good because it didn't play to the board. But against France, the reason I have fear higher is because your fear effects in the fear deck, which we haven't really talked too much about in the show so far, we'll pick them up against another adversary. But the fear effects are generally much stronger against France than they are against Sweden, and that's primarily because of defend and how much better defend is in this matchup. So fear is stronger here. In both cases, you're trying to get through and you're trying to close out the game, but it's also more important to close out the game against France. You have the inevitability against Sweden that you don't have against France, which is another reason why I put fear higher and better against France. And somebody already said in the comments how everything is good against France, and it's basically true. Everything except blight removal, that is. So here against the side of the fear, I've got a couple. I've got Portent as a disaster, which is a purely fear card. Rain of Blood is another. Again, you want to be looking for multiple ways, or a card that can do multiple things if possible. So some better examples will be things like Fire in the Sky. Clearly that's an all-star here because it adds strife. Or Shadows of the Burning Forest is another card that does fear, but it also can push stuff around. So you're probably looking to try pick up more of that than something that just generates fear on its own. And Terrifying Nightmares is a good major that sort of falls under the same category. You can deal up to 6 fear with that. It's pretty good. Clearly it's way behind something like Paralyzing Fright, but it's still decent here. And again, pushing 4 explorers could be really good to stop one of those big problematic builds as well. So quickly moving along to close these out, then we've got defend. Again, defend good here. Obviously defend is always good, but it's also good here. But it's reactionary, as we said before, so don't rely on it too heavily. Your defend 4s are generally pretty good here. Defend 4 we talked about with Sweden, definitely not so good, but it's a lot better against France. Your sweet spot of that kind of double explore turning into a single explore and 2 towns, so that's going to ravage for 5. So your defend of 4. You've got favor of the sun and starlit dark. You've got things like elusive ambushes, which can also pick off potentially explorers with the damage part of it. There's kind of a bunch of them. So clearly your 5s and 6s are great, but even your 4s are pretty good here. I also put Solidifies Echoes of Majesty Past as one example of a major here, which is some bits of small ball defense, so defense of 3, but it also has some skips in there as well. And it's got a kind of a very manageable threshold effect too. So I really like that card actually from Nature Incarnate. Penultimately, we've got support. I put support in neutral. Again, similar to Sweden, you don't want to be all in on this. It's clearly good when it's good and all of that. That's all fine. We said the same sort of things last time. A couple of cards that are pretty good in that sort of realm. Gift of Nature's Connection helps speed up your game. It gives you a bit whatever you need, which is one of my favorite minors. I love it. And Gift of Twin Days. Again, a lot of small ball effects will be good against France. Move this, move that, do a little ping, do a point of damage, do whatever, and multiplying that and doing it multiple times is really good. Hazard Spread Across the Island is one other card I thought is really good against France for the same reason we talked about with tokens before. Wilds is good, Strife is good, Beasts are good, Disease is good. Get your hazard spread across the land, get your 4 free elements, and go ahead and throw extra tokens on the board. So really nice. The other card I put in here I wanted to talk about briefly was Exaltation of the Incandescent Sky. I absolutely adore this card. This is one of my favorite cards in the entire game. It might even be my single favorite card in this whole game. I adore it. I love it. We'll talk probably at length about it another day, but this is one of those big support, big build up to cards that at first glance might not look like a good idea when everything I'm telling you is to be quick and don't go to the long game. But this is the type of effect that if the game goes long and you can hit this one, this can solve you a game big style. Does damage, gets extra cards out of your hand, makes things fast, stops 4 things happening on the island, so it could stop 4 massively problematic builds. It does everything you want. I love that card. It's amazing. Last thing is Blight Removal. It's awful. Teeming Rivers, one example. Don't play it. The other one is Ravaged Undergrowth Slithers Back to Life. Do play it. It's a major. It removes Blight, but it turns it into Wilds, and we like Wilds against France. So all of that is good. Very quickly here, guys. Again, spirit-wise, we talked about last time with Sweden, there's a lot of the same overlap with our spirits here. So added a couple of extras in, and we heard about quite a lot of these as well during the analysis. So I'm not gonna dwell on them. You know, Green, Volcano, Trickster, Voice, Sun, Behemoth, Thunderspeaker, Heart Vigil. We all mentioned about how they were good against Sweden, and they're all good for the exact same reasons here. There was a couple that were new though. We heard about Brett, we heard about Lure, we heard about Whirlwind, and we heard about Fangs and Keeper. All of those pretty good here against France, but maybe not so good, or in some cases bad against Sweden. And for the weak spirits, then in this realm, Finder, which was good against Sweden, not so good against France. It can't remove plastic. Neither can Bringer. Neither can Fractured, and Mist doesn't really like to remove them. So you know, all of those spirits kind of not so hot here. Serpent and Stone, bit too slow, bit too passive. One of Stone's worst matchups. Again, it's not absolutely awful, and Stone can be in anything, but something to be aware of, that Stone does a lot of reactive as opposed to proactive, and that's, as we said, not so hot. And then for the Blight removal reason, sort of stands on its own a little bit here, is Wildfire. Struggles against that slow healing ecosystem. So let's take very quickly, we'll talk about a game breakdown. I talked about it a small bit already in terms of some of the stuff that happened with Wounded Waters and Wildfire already, so I'll just step through a little bit on this. We're going pretty long here, folks. We're pushing 2 hours already, so I won't dig into this now. Everybody who's listening to the podcast and hasn't watched the video, again, I'll encourage you to stay for just a couple of more minutes more. You won't need to have seen the game to be able to enjoy this. Just briefly, Wounded Waters, it has everything actually. So quite interestingly, when I was playing Wounded Waters, I realized it has almost everything it needs to beat France. Quite strong spirit in its own way. I don't think it's up there in terms of tier list or anything like that, but you know, it's got damage, it's got moving things, it's got moving to hand, it's got pinging off explorers, it's got basically everything that you need. In terms of the animal build versus the water build here, very clearly I went the route of animal because it deals lots of damage, and I strongly believe that that's the right way to go for this particular matchup. So I was happy with what I did there. You know, it deals a lot of proactive damage. We talked about that earlier in the game, when you can think and plan and hit your innates and set them up so that when the things explore, you're proactively going and dealing with them. And obviously the animal innate gives you that kind of fast phase as well. So there's quite a bit of fast damage. It's got a unique that does it as well, but it also has that kind of, as I say, it's slightly reactive because you're setting up a slow phase, but you've got things like you've got control in there, you've got a disease ad, which is really good, all that sort of stuff. So I didn't even use the hand movement to set up the slave rebellion, because quite honestly it just didn't really come up and I didn't need it. And also, if you've seen the video, my brain was melting out my ears, so I was really struggling towards the end of the first night. That was done over 2 days, and I'll comment on that in just a moment. And the Blight Gather even was quite good. So Blight removal, as we said, not so hot, but just gathering it came up quite a few times actually, which was really nice. Wildfire then, so these spirits have quite a nice combo together. So even the Blight Gather I just talked about worked really well. It came up a couple of times where I gathered the Blight out of a land during the growth phase, and then Wildfire then grew into the land and dealt the damage. So that came up I think at least once, if not twice. So that was pretty cool. But ultimately Wildfire had a very passive game, which is not like them at all. I had to reclaim like 2, maybe even 3 times in like a 7-turn game, which was not not the case with Transforming Wildfire under normal circumstances. I had horrible drafts. I missed on my elements basically every single time. So because I was missing my elements, I couldn't hit the innate. And of course, the innate was super important because we got into this very interesting spot where I was rushing, obviously, to get the blight back on the card, so from the panel back to the card. So a lot of this game came down to that kind of race where I was trying to get the blight back on the spirit panel and then rushing just on time to get it back on the card. So it was actually super interesting, and I wish I had stopped about 10 minutes ago or 5 minutes ago and gave you a spoiler warning and told you, hey, go and look at this floaty thing up here and go and click and watch the game and then come back to us. So if you got to this moment in the video, now I'm going to tell you, go and click this floaty thing up in the corner, go and watch the game that I just kind of half spoiled, but I didn't announce the end result, which was at least something. So anyway, look, for everybody, if you've either gone and just watched it or you've watched it already, or indeed if you just haven't watched it and you don't care, that's also fine. But I did win, which was quite nice. I did win, and it was one of them games that I talked about earlier in the show where it sort of went to hell, As I said, Wildfire was playing a very passive game. I couldn't get my elements right, which meant I couldn't get my growth options right, and I was sort of all over the place a little bit with them. It's the worst game I ever played of Transforming Wildfire, which is a spirit I really, really do quite enjoy, and it's a pity that I made such a mess of it for the playthrough that I got on the show. But it had some things going for it. Flames Fury was an MVP. Flames Fury on Wounded Waters is insane. So that was something. So we got to see that quite a bit because I reclaimed a bunch. The downgrading of the explorers or the downgrading of the buildings into explorers, it was a bit of a hindrance. It came up a little bit, but again, because I played such a passive game, I wasn't even destroying all that much of the board. So it was kind of not hugely impactful, let's say. But the blight, the interesting thing for sure in this game was that blight dance and getting the blight on the card for just long enough to get it back on the card, and doing that just long enough to not run out of towns and just to get over the edge, and all of those kind of little bits and pieces along the way was very interesting. In hindsight, it was also sort of ugly and clunky, and I was, as I say, my brain was giving up. It got really late at night and I was like trying to figure these puzzles out at it was like 1:30 a.m. or something, and that wasn't good. So not so clean and not so smooth, but very interesting all the same. So that was it. That was the game. The kind of key takeaways were preempting either the explorers or where the towns were going to be happening, and being proactive, focusing on the tempo clearly here. So there was a couple of times where I just let some bigger builds go or bigger lands go because I couldn't deal with them, and that was fine. I didn't invest too heavily. I didn't panic, and also I didn't panic about the blight. I took my time. I planned 2-3 turns in advance of when it was going to come off, and ultimately that all kind of worked out pretty well. So that's it, folks. We're just almost there. We're coming up to 2 hours now. Last thing we're going to talk about here is going to be what's next, clearly. So up next is going to be the next adversary. So we had Sweden, we had France, and then right above them, then we're going now to diff about 9.5. So I'm going to be really pedantic and awkward and annoying, and I'm going to call this 9.5. And there's a reason for that. It's a relative scoring, and I do want to give a scale from kind of bottom to top. So for me, you go kind of 9, then you go 9.5, and that's going to be Brandenburg, Prussia. So quite a few people in the comments already were talking about how they were similar, and I agree. They are also the other sort of rush adversary, so it just so happens that they all kind of get grouped up at the bottom, which from a content creation perspective is a little bit tricky because I have to keep talking about similar things and saying them in different ways. So you'll have to forgive me on that one just a little bit. But ultimately, I do believe that Brandenburg, Prussia are probably third from bottom. I put these on par. I said last time there's two together here for me that are at 9.5 before we hit the kind of next level up, and that's kind of just what they are. We'll get into their details and everything next time, so that's all fine. Of course we need to decide on who we're going to play into BP, but before I do, I just a very quick note on the playthrough itself. So I just sort of alluded to it there before, but I've sort of, after now playing I think 3 playthroughs, this is going to be my 4th, I'm getting the feel that I need to get on top a little bit of what's going on. The last one ran really long, and as I said, really late, and the brain burn and everything else sort of it took away from my content, which I don't want to happen. So there was a couple of comments here that I want to make. Is first of all, no more late games starting at like 11 or whatever time that was at night. It's way too late, so I can't let that happen anymore. So that's something I'm committing to, starting earlier from now on and being fresher for my games. The other thing is I need to play faster. And I talked about this from Magic, and you've clearly heard me talk and in my episodes. So it's probably no surprise to any of you that I'm a little bit of slow and ponderous and strategic about almost everything. And certainly my gameplay is of the same ilk. So I need to get faster. I need to be less concerned with perfect play, and that unfortunately is something that's been drilled into me from playing so many bloody 6-6 games where you have to do that. You absolutely have to optimize every single action you take in order to win, because it's just so unforgiving. But level 6s are not quite the same, and these can be won without perfect play. So I need to play faster, and that's something that I'm committing to doing from now on, is be just less all in on every single decision. I don't need to explain every single decision to the camera, and I don't need to stop and take 20 minutes during every growth step, so a growth phase. So that's one thing. The other thing is I've decided that I'm going to be a little bit less in on the post-production for my playthrough episodes. So the card cam is going to be a decision and something that I want to try out next time. So you'll see that on the next playthrough. I'm going to stick a little camera in the corner off to the side of my table, and basically to replicate what I've been doing so far, which is when I'm talking about a card, I'm obviously bringing up a card in the overlay, right, which I'm doing in this episode, and I'll do in my podcast episodes. But in my playthrough episodes, instead of having to go back through and watch all the footage and constantly overlay the cards in at the time, because it's really useful for the video and I really want to have that, but it's slow and it requires a lot of post-production. So rather than doing that, what I'm going to try next time is I'm going to stick a little card cam in, and I will put the card underneath, and hopefully that'll get the nice zoomed in shot, the clear shot, if I can get the camera to work, and it'll give the same kind of effect, but I'll be able to do it in real time on the table. So let's see how that works. That's going to be something to look out for on the next one. Very final note on playthrough format here, and it's a little bit the elephant in the room. Something that came up yesterday, I believe, was the launch of a new Spirit Island podcast, which is Spirited Discussion, the guys have called it, which is Kaelin, Norit, and Alex, I'm not sure his surname, have launched a new podcast. And yeah, obviously, it's one of them things, but as they said, I'll replicate exactly the words they said. It's super cool to have content in this space. I love the Kindred Spirit podcast before. If they came back, I'd be super chuffed about that as well. So, there's absolutely no reason why we can't all exist in the same space. I'm glad that I have the playthrough aspect of my thing. That's kind of what I'll be leaning into, that, as I had already been doing, and they're obviously leaning more into the podcast format and audio medium and all the things that go along with that. So they're two different things, but ultimately the news here is that super happy to have it, and I'll be a keen listener, and we'll certainly be commenting on anything that's relevant from them across. So all good stuff there. But look, we'll get to the last thing here, which is going to be our 3 options. So clearly here, again, we're always, as always before, there will be a poll going live, which is going to be giving you options of 3 as before. So it's going to be an easy, a hard, and a wild card. And again, we're not talking about, no-brainer matchups on the easy or the hard side. There's going to be play to all 3 of these. So it'll be interesting to see, what comes through. I think had the wild card option win twice in a row now. So let's see whether the easy or the hard one comes in. And based on how grindy my last one was, maybe the easy one looks like a better choice for people this time, but we shall see. Starting up anyway, as I say, it's our easy option, and that is going to be Breath of Darkness down your spine and Volcano Looming High, which is my boy. I mentioned I wrote a what's the word I'm looking for here? Strategy guide on Volcano, so I tend to know it pretty well, and I think this is probably Volcano's best matchup. Breath of Darkness as well, I think, is pretty good here, and I think looking at Red's Red Revenge's matchup axis, I think he rates it as a good one for Breath as well. So I think both spirits pretty good, lots of damage, lots of control with explorers, all that sort of good stuff. So that's your easy option. Your hard option is going to be Keeper of the Forbidden Wilds in base form and Fractured Days Split the Sky. This is a funky one. Again, I was looking through Red's matchup axis because I used that to kind of help me make out plans, and of course I obviously use my own knowledge and experience with matchups too. And this one is interesting. So clearly here, Keeper and Fractured are very, very strong spirits. They're absolutely up there in the kind of S tier sort of range, plus or minus depending on how you feel. But these are very strong spirits, but not so sure in terms of how well they play against Brandenburg Prussia. BP hit you fast, and neither of these spirits are particularly fast. And Fractured Days, of course, it's got all that broken slip stuff, but what are you slipping with Keeper? Are you slipping a blight removal card? Are you slipping a draw card? So yeah, I'm not necessarily sure I would say there's synergy between the two, but maybe the anti-synergy between the two and the fact that it's two S tier spirits that kind of struggle makes that quite an interesting matchup. So that's one to look out for. Finally, your wild card option here, it's going to be Dancing Up Earthquakes and Shroud of Silent Mist in its base form. So clearly here, Shroud Stranded is kind of the default kind of go-to for most people, but I figured it might be interesting to get the old base version up on the episode, and certainly because it's generally a weaker version as well, that was kind of in my mind as well as far as the matchup is concerned. But you've, for two different reasons, got some interesting things happening here. So Dancing Up Earthquakes, this is again gonna want to be a matchup where its defend power is pretty good, but it's not going to get to use that long-term sort of earthquakey stuff, so it's struggling a bit there. And you've got Shroud, who again, it's struggling to the board, but it generates a lot of fear, and Brandenburg Prussia has a very low fear deck, so getting to churn through the fear could be quite interesting. So that's something to kind of look out for. So 3 different options, very interesting options, very happy to play any of them, but please do go over right now when you finish watching this episode and hit your choice in the poll, and we'll get that one up next. So that's it for today, folks. We're now at 18:15, 6:15 p.m. My wife will kill me when I get downstairs, but it was worth it. I stuck around. I hope you did too. Really appreciate you being here as always. Finally, before you leave, as I say, please do hit your like and subscribe and all that good stuff. And please do drop a comment. I'd really, really like to hear from you in terms of, what's your thoughts on Brandenburg Prussia? Are they easy? Are they hard? The usual sort of questions. Got anything that you'd like to say about them in terms of what you like, what you don't like, what sort of cards, spirits, etc. So please do jump down into the channel and into the comments, I should say, and hit me up. But that's going to be it for now. Really, really thank you again for being here, and until the next time, may your manifestations be always powerful and glorious. See you then.